Today on CityCast DC, a new Trump administration report says the Smithsonian Institution is run by radicals who are not trustworthy. And while the report focused on the American History Museum, a lot of people read it as a shot at the institution's leader, Lonnie Bunch. Clint Smith is the author of a recent piece in The Atlantic that profiles Bunch and ponders the future of the Smithsonian. He's here to walk us through what all of this may portend. Today is Monday, July 13th. I'm Michael Schaefer. Here's what DC's talking about. Clint, welcome.
Thanks so much. Good to be here.
So this past weekend, literally on the 4th of July itself, the White House issued a scathing report saying the Smithsonian can't be trusted to tell America's story. It paints them as a bunch of sort of academic radicals. You've spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about Smithsonian in this recent piece for The Atlantic. You wrote about the Smithsonian as an institution and Lonnie Bunch, the head, as a person. What did you make of this news?
I wasn't surprised by it. I think it is consistent with the sort of position that the administration has taken with around the Smithsonian since they came into office the second time around. They began the second term by issuing a pretty scathing executive order. President Trump posted on Truth Social that he thought that the Smithsonian was way too woke, as he likes to say, that they spent too much time talking about sad things and
like how slavery is bad.
How slavery is bad. Too much time talking about how slavery was bad. And so, given the sort of public pronouncements that they've made, and then also what I've learned from my reporting that's been happening kind of behind the scenes, it felt like a public manifestation of feelings that have been present between the Smithsonian and the current administration for a while now.
So, my radar went up of, okay, this is it. They're getting ready to fire Lonnie Bunch. I thought it was interesting, though, that they don't single him out for criticism. The person they really focus on is Anthea Hardig, the head of the American History Museum. Obviously, there's a lot of sweeping statements about the Smithsonian, too. What did you make of that targeting?
It is interesting and in many ways conspicuous that Lonnie, despite being the head of the Smithsonian, has not been, to my understanding, publicly targeted by Trump or by the administration in a way that maybe some other heads of different federal agencies or institutions that receive federal funding in the way that the Smithsonian does have. And so I think part of that is because Secretary Bunch is a very personable and charismatic guy, right? It might not be deeper than the fact that Trump kind of likes him on a personal level. And as I report in the story for The Atlantic, they had a lunch where Secretary Bunch thought that he was going to go in and get fired, that he was going to be attacked, that he was going to be sort of unrelentingly antagonized. And he went in there and Trump talked to him about the curtains and the color of the chandelier and his renovations of the ballroom. It is interesting that he has attacked the Smithsonian so much and not seemingly attacked Lonnie directly. And even in this scathing report, as you discuss, he's picking a very different target to go after. And so maybe it's charm, but also maybe part of it is a clear sense that Lonnie is almost a larger than life figure. And if he were to go directly after Lonnie, it's going to create a much larger spectacle than maybe he's prepared for.
Right. And so one of the ways of getting rid of somebody is you do stuff that makes it intolerable for them. You fire an underling in a way that you may not actually have the legal power to do, which is what happened at the Portrait Gallery, and create a situation where Bunch resigns in protest. And that is sort of a much less troublesome way of getting rid of somebody, it seems to me. Do you think that's what's going on?
Well, the difference between the Smithsonian and the Kennedy Center, for example, is that Trump does not have the power to singularly appoint and replace the people who are on the board. And so while in a way that he could come in to the Kennedy Center and engage in a sort of sweeping sweeping changing of the guard, and then appoint himself as being in charge of the Kennedy Center in ways that would allow him ostensibly to transform that institution. We've realized subsequently that it's not as easy as he would like it to be. He can't do that in this.
Can you break this down for me? Or people around the Smithsonian have said, well, this fall when they fully get power to do this, meaning by that point he will have been able to appoint enough board members who are going to see the world as he does. Can you explain sort of who's who in the board, and if you can't just clear them out, like who appoints them and how many of them are the president's?
Yeah, so I guess this gets us into the weeds a bit. So the Smithsonian is run by a board of regents. The people who ultimately ascend to the board of regents are nominated by other members of the board. That then is sent to Congress. Congress either approves or disapproves, votes up or votes down, these members of the board in committee. And then from there, that those prospective board of regents members go to the president's desk to be signed off on. And this typically is a sort of, the president signing off on the new members of the Board of Regents is usually a pretty perfunctory thing. Nobody thinks twice about it. Obviously, in this administration, things that were at once perfunctory are no longer, as we can see in the Pentagon and in the military, where Pete Hegseth has really put his thumb on the scale to prevent certain officers from ascending to these ranks of admiral and general, specifically Black people and women. And so what they have these rolling terms, and they can serve two terms. Each term, I believe, is 6 years. And some of them are members of Congress. Some of them are citizen members of the Board of Regents. It includes the Chief Supreme Court Justice, who's the Chancellor of the Board, Justice Roberts. It includes Vice President J.D. Vance. And so the concern was that by the time the members of the Board of Regents who support Lonnie had their terms come to an end, that then because Congress, for the most part over the last 2 years, has kind of acquiesced largely to Trump and his wishes, and because Trump and the administration said specifically in their executive order last year that they wanted to appoint members of the board who would be amenable to the sort of MAGification of the Smithsonian. The concern was that once these folks left the board, they would be replaced and approved via Congress, and that those people would be MAGA supporters and do Trump's bidding. Something is happening where people have rolled off the board, but they've not yet been replaced. My sense is that the institution is sort of slow walking the process and trying to not send the prospective nominees to Congress to be considered, because at this moment, Secretary Bunch still has enough members who are on the board who are supportive of him and want him to be in place, and that if they went, and that anyone they would send to Congress would have to be somebody that President Trump would ultimately approve of. And obviously those are not the kind of people that the board wants joining its ranks, because the divergence in how they perceive what history in America should look like and how it should be rendered. All that's to say, we're in a bit of a holding period, because obviously if Congress shifts in the midterms, that changes the possibility of creating members of the Board of Regents who will continue to, in a nonpartisan way and in an objective way, do the work of the Smithsonian, regardless of the sort of political pressures that are coming from the top.
Here is something from our sponsors at the DC Department of Behavioral Health. DC is turning a corner, and the numbers back it up. Fatal opioid overdoses dropped 33% in this city from 2023 to 2024. That's not just data, that's real people, real families, still together. But the work isn't done, and neither are we. If you or someone you love is struggling, help is closer than you think. Text Live Long DC to 888-811 to connect with treatment, housing, and recovery support right here in the district. Free Narcan is available at nearly 40 locations across DC, because nobody should lose someone for lack of access. And if you're in crisis right now, call or text 988. Know your worth, know your alternatives, know your value, know yourself. Recovery is possible. Find out how at knowyourpathdc.com. So you mentioned before, Bunch has sort of become a larger-than-life figure to a lot of people. As I am a longtime Washingtonian, native Washingtonian. I don't think I could name you a previous secretary of the Smithsonian, but he's a person who's really sort of captured the imagination. And one of the things he's done, he's like this avuncular figure. He is nobody's sort of stereotype of a like radical academic, jargon spewer. And as you noted, he's charmed Trump. Given this backdrop with new members coming on the board and so on, he's been pretty adept at charming. Do you have a sense of what he may be doing behind the scenes, what his relationships are with the new board members? And I'm just thinking about his ability to sort of surf this moment.
There have been no new board members put in place since the beginning of the second Trump term. Citizen board members, with the exceptions of these members of Congress and obviously Vice President Vance. It's hard to overstate the extent, to your point, that like he is a popular and more recognizable secretary of the Smithsonian, certainly more than there has been in recent memory. One of the people I spoke to for this story referred to him as the sort of Beyonce of museums. So you walk around with him at a history conference and people are following him, trying to take selfies. They're like photographing him as he walks by in the atrium. And so he got to that point, and he has become this person in part because he is so adept at navigating the political realities of any sort of political ecosystem that he's a part of, right? And so part of what made, before he was the secretary of the Smithsonian, he was the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And he had to navigate the realities of Bush presidency, then an Obama presidency, then a Biden presidency, and then a Trump presidency in between those. And so he is very familiar with how to comport himself in ways that are ultimately in service of protecting the institution, whether that institution be the National Museum of African American History and Culture or now the Smithsonian more broadly. And that is his primary and in many ways sort of singular interest, is making sure that he protects this institution and all the people who work for it and the century plus history that it carries in its walls.
I'm curious about his role in managing Inside. We have historically, like kind of the stereotypical left-wing academic looks down on something like the Smithsonian. They think, this is a federal thing where they're scared of their own shadow and they're pulling all their punches in case some idiot member of Congress, doesn't like a piece of text. What do you make of the charge that the Smithsonian does take a sort of academic, fashionable, radical view of history? And how has he managed? I'm sure there are individual curators in there who want to push the envelope further than he's willing to do. And it's just in the nature of any organization. How has he managed that?
So I think part of what's important to understand about Secretary Bunch is that he himself is a product of the Smithsonian. One of his first jobs after his time in graduate school was working at the Smithsonian, at the National Museum of American History as a young curator. And ultimately, he sort of ascended through the ranks to become a major curator at that museum. He left to become head of a major museum in Chicago, and then was recruited to return to the Smithsonian as the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It's hard to imagine someone who is more, both more a product of and more invested in what the Smithsonian is and maintaining its intellectual integrity, its scholarly integrity, and also who recognizes the sort of singular public appeal that the Smithsonian has, that in many ways, the thing about public historians more broadly is that they recognize that they often have an opportunity to transform the way the public thinks about history in a way that has a much wider reach than a traditional academic historian who, is lucky to have a couple thousand people read their books. But, you think about an institution like Smithsonian, millions and millions and millions of people visit these institutions every year. And so,
and do you think it's kept faith with those millions and millions of people? I mean, is it a place where they have snuck in sort of jargon and alienating things, which is the line from the critics?
Yeah, I think what you will find is what you find in any museum is that you have a myriad of exhibits that were all created in different periods of time. And in many ways, the same way books do, the same way films do, the same way journalism does, it is shaped and animated by the social and political realities of its time. And so certainly if you are looking in the National Museum of American History, an exhibit on the presidency or the first ladies that was constructed and imagined a few decades ago, our conception of the presidency has been pulled and stretched and ruptured and rebuilt and reimagined in part because of so much of what has happened over the last 2 years, over the last 10 years, over the last 15. And because the nature of our political reality is different, and because of the way that scholarship has evolved to understand the presidency. And so a exhibit on the presidency made in 2025 would look different than an exhibit on the presidency made in 1995. And I think what you find is that more recent exhibits reflect more recent iterations of scholarship and also were constructed in specific socio-political moments, maybe in the backdrop of Black Lives Matter, maybe in the backdrop of the first Black president, maybe in the backdrop of the first Trump presidency. And all of them, because they are made by humans who are themselves impacted by and shaped by these moments, do reflect those. What I would say, though, is that I think the power of the Smithsonian, and I think part of what Secretary Bunch would say he wants to maintain, is this idea that America is a place that has done a lot of good, and it is a place that has done a lot of harm. And in order to understand America, you have to understand both of those things. And you can't run from either of them. You can't only pretend as if America is the shining light on the hill, but you also can't only pretend that America is an inherently evil entity that has no possibility for redemption and reimagining. And so what these institutions attempt to do is hold the totality and the complexity and the moral inconsistency of America in these different museums from a host of different perspectives.
So you mentioned it's obviously a different management structure than the Kennedy Center, and it's different as a set of institutions. But, look, living here in Washington, we all saw these crowds that were gathered to watch Trump's name come off the Kennedy Center. And you see what's happened to the ticket sales as and that is a bunch of sort of gray-haired government retirees who like classical music voting with their feet, saying they don't want to be associated with this. If it were to come about that Lonnie Bunch were fired or it was perceived that he was forced out, what do you think the fallout would be? I mean, both in terms of specifics, like the shape of these museums, but also kind of the broader political, cultural context in one city.
I think part of the reason President Trump has not directly attacked Secretary Bunch is because even if he were successful in removing Bunch from that position, it is far from clear that he would be able to then subsequently put somebody in charge of the Smithsonian who would be able to implement his vision of it. The Smithsonian is protected to some degree by this Board of Regents and by the sort of bureaucratic infrastructure that has been created to prevent any executive from being able to just sort of wield, the whatever ideological positions that they hold and use it to sort of impose on the Smithsonian museums. So I think that what they are trying to do right now is create the conditions and use these sorts of reports to pressure the Smithsonian into, on its own accord, ostensibly on its own accord, removing some of the things that it doesn't like. And if it is the case that Lonnie decides to step down, I don't think that itself will mean that the Smithsonian museums will then subsequently fall into like that now we're going to have a statue of Trump in the National Museum of American History.
I think someday we will, but it might not be the way displayed the way he wants.
I think that's probably right. And so yeah, I think it remains to be seen. I think the question is ultimately is Secretary Bunch going to stay until the midterms, and who is the person who replaces him, and to what extent do they have the personality, the charisma, the political acumen to navigate this moment as carefully and as thoughtfully as the current secretary has done.
So look, before I let you go, you're an accomplished poet, writer about history. You've spent a lot of time thinking about the way we reckon with our past. Big picture, you spent a lot of time at the Smithsonian, you publish a piece, and then this report drops. What does all this say to you about this sort of moment we're in American history?
I think we're in a moment where history is as contested as it has ever been. We've had moments, we've had contestations around history for as long as America has been America. And the difference is that now we are experiencing the antagonism from the people who are in the highest, most powerful positions in the land. And I think that makes this moment unique when the president, with the bully pulpit that he has, is continuously attacking the idea that we should think of America as a place that has a complex history, that has a history full of contradictions, that has a history that we should honor and a history that we should, try not to repeat, that has a history that we should, that has people who we should understand, not solely for what they have contributed to America, but also what they've taken away from many people. And I think there are many people who don't like to hold that complexity. There are many people who don't like to sit with the duality of America, because that means they have to sit with the duality of themselves. It means they have to sit with the sort of moral inconsistency of themselves. The thing I tell people all the time is, I'm a person in my life who has done things that I am proud of, and I'm a person who's done things that I'm not proud of, because I'm human and I make mistakes. And the way that I try to live in the world and being in community with folks, the way I try to raise my kids, is that you don't pretend as if you never made a mistake. You don't pretend as if you have nothing to ever apologize for. You try to learn from those mistakes, and you try to use those mistakes as an opportunity to become a better version of yourself in the future. And so if that's the standard I hold myself to, and that's the standard I hold my children to, why would that not be the standard that I hold my country to? America is a place that is both and we should lean into the both andness of this country, rather than pretending as if the country, as if any of us, as if our politics are all just one thing.
There's that line, that Faulkner line, if the past isn't gone, it's not even past. And I thought of that on the 4th of July, when all of a sudden the skies open up and the mall is evacuated, and you have huge numbers of people riding out the storm inside the African American History Museum. What did you make of that picture? As someone who's just spent a whole lot of time thinking about the Smithsonian.
I think that in some ways that's the only way you were going to ever get a lot of those folks into that museum, is by threatening them with the idea of being struck by lightning. But who knows? Hope maybe they saw something in there that, who knows if it'll change their thinking, but maybe it planted a seed that complicated their thinking a little more than when they had gone into it.
Clint, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And before we go, we've got new members to thank: Charles R., Todd L., Kristen B., Edward L., Elizabeth F., Jackie D., RK, Cynthia S., VB, Alyssa P., Vivian S., Jonathan C., Lucy H., and Stephen R. Thank you all very much. And if you want to become a member and help fuel our newsroom, head to membership.citycast.fm. It's $10 a month or $100 a year. And that is all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.